Shabbat Shalom. There is a story of a young chassid who wanted to go work in the great synagogue of his sect. So he was sent to work in the kitchens to serve all the meals and to cook for his synagogue. And he found soon enough that he was the one that they made to carry the heaviest pots and the heaviest utensils. And he got very tired. So eventually he managed to find a way to get a word out to the Rabbi. And he said, the women in the kitchen are getting a lot of work out of me and I'm tired all the time. What should I do? So the Rebbe remained silent, receiving the note, and eventually said, well, I can tell them not to, but I wanted to let you know that if you work with the spirit of love and service in your heart, then the heavy work will not feel so heavy. It will be bearable. So in the second paragraph of the Shema that we say twice a day, V'haya im shamoa, and it will be, if you hear all the commandments I command to you this day, to love the Lord your God and to serve Him. And the word for serve Him in Hebrew is la'avod, which is the same word as avodah, as work, right? Service is work. Service is not something theoretical, abstract. Service is something you have to give yourself over to. It's real. It's work. But it's also holy work. It's work that lifts you up, that elevates your soul, that gives you something. One of my friends is in the Israeli army and the commander of many men. He was born in Los Angeles to Israeli parents, but then later on moved to Israel as a teenager. But he truly believed in his service to Israel. And when he told me once that when he was out guarding in his first year, he took it very seriously. He'd take his gun and he'd pace back and forth. And all the other Israelis who were sitting in a tent would say to him, what are you doing? They thought he was crazy because he was taking it so seriously. But he truly put his heart into it. And he eventually became a commander, commanding many hundreds of men, and goes back every year for Miluim, for the reserves. But we each serve as best we can in our hearts. We each give what we can, bringing to our service. And it's not always glorious. When my brother served in the IDF, he was already too old when he was enlisted, moving back to do all the good stuff. So he ended up lugging around air conditioning units for many months. And he told me the pay was awful and the work was unrewarding, but he did it. We don't serve for the pay. We serve because we feel compelled by values in our hearts and ideals, and the idea that we each have a duty to the nation that we live in and the communities that we grow up in, to do our part, even if it is small, even though the pay is horrible and the work is hard. So in our parsha this week, Abraham, we find many of the great events of his life. And if you look at Abraham's life is a life of tremendous service, every part of it. And he's not even called to his life until he's 75 years old. He's 75 years old and suddenly he's called to a life of service. So he leaves Canaan and so many different parts he has to do. He has to settle into a new strange land. He has to go to war to save his nephew Lot. He has to circumcise himself and his son Ishmael. He has to, as we read this week, while healing, greet the 3 divine visitors, and he has to find faith in his heart that it is true that his wife Sarah will give birth in her old age to a son. And he has to argue with God to save the evil cities. He makes deals with kings and local important people in Canaan. And finally, his duty is tested the most when he's called to sacrifice his son. But what's amazing about Abraham is whatever he does fully, with a full heart of service. Not always easily, but he always does it. And Abraham is the one who gives birth to a concept in our tradition called zrizim makdimim la mitzvah, those that you have to rush to do a mitzvah. And then you get double mitzvah points when you do so. If you do something half-hearted, then you get half mitzvah points. And not only that, but Abraham's life is one of protection. and he receives divine protection. And at a certain point, towards the end of our portion, Avimelech, who's a king of a foreign land, says to him, I see that God is with you in everything you do. And what does it mean? It means that, he's, according to our commentators, that he could see that there was a presence of Abraham guarding him. And so we pray 3 times a day. We say in the first blessing of the Amidah, Magen Avraham, shield of Abraham. So my grandfather on my mother's side was in the Canadian Armed Forces during the war, a navigator. And then he became a member of Parliament in Canada, and he was head of the Canadian delegation to NATO. And I recently found his inaugural speech that he made to Parliament, his first time he was elected. At first he talked about service and following in a tradition that gave him great pleasure. And then he commented what was unique in his time. They were also going through a period of political turmoil. And he commented on how wonderful it was that there were politicians from across the aisle who were appointed to different positions in the Canadian Parliament. And he wrote, they are the symbols of which some honorable gentleman said could not be. They are symbols of a national unity those of us in this party have sought over many weary years. Finally, when we honor those who served, and we're also honoring service itself and the belief that service and its selflessness is one of the ways that we can find unity in a divided world. And we feel compelled to bring our hearts onto the table for a larger issue. We find that there is a meeting place for others who also feel compelled to do so. We do it out of our sense of belonging, out of a sense of our own beliefs. And so though the road be long and the work be hard and the pay could be better, we know also that the true rewards of service come b'shamayim, in the heavens, but that the beauty it renders to our lives and ennobling our lives. And we can pray as well after 2 elections in the last 2 weeks, that they could also lead us to unity in service of finding common ideals and a common vision for the nations that we hold dear and the beliefs